What is Karl Ove Knausgaard trying to do in his 6-volume novel, My Struggle? Daniel Mendelsohn joins us to help make sense of it all. How do you capture the history of America in one volume? Jill Lepore will be here to talk about her new book, These Truths. Plus, our critics Dwight Garner, Paul Sagal, and Jen Salai will join us to talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now is Daniel Mendelsohn. He is the author of, among other books, most recently, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic. And he took on the very epic task this week of reading, it took him longer than a week, but in this week's book review, he reviews the 6th volume of Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle, while reading as well the previous 5 volumes. So Daniel, thank you for doing that, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
For those who are Knausgaard novices, just give a bit of a background here. I mean, who is Karl Ove Knausgaard? When did he sort of burst onto the literary scene?
Well, he was already a figure, starting about 20 years ago in Norwegian literature. He published 2 very good novels early on. And then around 2009, I believe, started publishing this serial novel, My Struggle, which is a minute reconstruction of every moment of his life from infancy on. And that the sort of boldness and strangeness of that project is really what made him an international superstar and made this book a kind of a literary event all over the world.
The first book came out here in 2012.
Yeah.
And he's been writing these. He also did this last year, a kind of series of 4 smaller books on top of it, I guess, just for fun.
You have to keep going.
I guess. We should say, in talking about this, that this is 3,500 pages worth of work here.
Yes. There are 6 novels, and they run about 500 to 600. Well, most of them, except the last one, is over 1,100 pages. So he's clearly interested in making an epic statement. I mean, when you do that, you want people to know that this is weighty in every conceivable sense of the word. You know, he's making a big literary gambit here. You know, I have to say, so as I said in my review, there are incredibly tedious parts because part of his goal is to recreate life itself, every single movement, every gesture. And this is an interesting project. It can wear thin, as I said, do we really need to know that an elevator is that shaft that runs through the middle of your building? But he's doing something in a very purposeful way. There are really strong parts of the whole epic. The father in particular, he had this abusive and rather scary father who sort of haunts the whole work all through 6 volumes in different ways. And to my mind, and I know I'm not alone in saying this, he is the strongest thing in the whole book and a kind of memorable figure. In a way, I have to say that many other characters aren't, because everything gets swallowed up by the narrating I. It's how he feels about everything, his feelings. I felt this, I was heartbroken, I was excited, and he sort of swallows up all the other characters, even though you get to know them. The uncle, the poor wife who has a nervous breakdown when he starts publishing this series of books. But he takes up all the oxygen, and I think that can be a stumbling block for a lot of readers. Although, to be fair, a lot of people eat it up. And I think part of that, as I said, is that we are living in a moment where everybody is narrating every single aspect of their lives all the time. It's
right.
What
We've all written 3,500 page books. We've just done it on Twitter or Instagram.
Exactly.
You talked about how he narrates sort of the minutia, about how he talks about his emotions, but how much of this is about him as a writer? I mean, I think you said that he claims to eschew any prettifying literary technique. So how does it actually read? How is the writing itself?
Well, the writing is he's very self-conscious about not being writerly, in quotation marks, you know. So there's nothing fancy. There are no metaphors. There's no beautiful language. It's not, thank God, my least favorite word in the critical language, lyrical.
I hate that word too.
But it's a kind of grinding everyday prose, which he does very self-consciously. And in fact, he makes a very interesting gesture in the first volume. The first pages of the first volume are beautifully written. It's all about the human heart at the moment it stops beating, the moment of death. And it's a mesmerizingly beautiful few pages. And then it stops. And then he gets into the kind of writing that he's going to be doing for the next 3,550 pages, as if to say, I can do that kind of beautiful writerly writing, but that's not what I'm interested in. So he's chosen a kind of prose register that reflects his interest in the mechanical minutiae of everyday life.
And why is he interested in that? What's his goal here in writing all of that out?
Well, I think he wants to capture, in an era in which we are capturing reality in many different ways, every moment, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, every moment of our lives is being represented somehow in pictures and images, sharing MP3 files, And he wants to give back to the novel, I think, the authority to describe life. It's a very kind of 19th century notion. And so there's a famous, at this point, famous passage in the first book where this bunch of high school kids trying to get some booze to go to a New Year's Eve party. And it takes 70 pages to describe what is not, in fact, a very interesting action. And it's as if he's trying to say the novel is still the preeminent means of representation of life. And I think it's rather touching because it's really very 19th century in a certain way. So I think that accounts for his interest in recreating sentence by sentence, every gesture, every word, every feeling, every moment.
And yet he's
it's very fine-grained.
He's not working on a kind of large tableau like many of the big 19th century novels, though, right?
No, because it's all there's something very... it's funny that you say that because at the same time, there's something incredibly airless and hermetic about this because everything is filtered through his consciousness. It's not like, say, Balzac was somebody who's looking at the grand picture of the world, society, class, and giving you everything. It's weirdly without oxygen because he and his perception of everything is sucking up all the oxygen.
I've heard from a number of people who've read it, and I will be upfront here just in saying that I have not, that they find what you've described as the tediousness kind of mesmerizing in a way. And as someone who's not read it, I sort of think of it as kind of like watching the Whirling Dervishes, where you're sort of entranced by it. And they said it's boring, but the very boringness is kind of fascinating.
Yes, and I would say that that's probably his point. And I will admit right from the start that I felt that too. In fact, I read a big chunk of 4 and 5 while I was vacationing in Florida with a mutual friend of ours. And you're simultaneously sort of irritated and completely hypnotized. I've in my life, I will admit this on air, I have watched a lot of soap operas, and it is exactly the same feeling. You sort of recognize the banality of it even as you need your next fix. But that's what I think is one of the interesting things about the project, because life is like that. We are mesmerized by the minutiae of our own lives because that's what we have, right? So I think I don't think this is a project without value by a long shot. I think there is something here and people recognize that. You can't fool all of the readers all of the time, so to speak. At the end of the day, I think the question that the critic and also the reader has to ask ourselves is, what is the vision of the world that you get? 3,600 pages is a major investment. And that bothered me a little bit at the end. I felt, you were the one who just asked, do you know anything about Norway? Do you know anything about anything? No, I know a lot about this one guy.
Right.
And, he would say, well, that's the point.
Is he an interesting guy?
Yeah. I mean, he's very intelligent, and his consciousness, he's a little bit younger than I am, but a lot of what he describes are the things that we have to deal with, not least balancing the career and the family. And, these are things that people struggle with, hence the title. Right? That's part
We'll
of the
get back
title.
to that title because there's more to that title.
Yeah. But, and in that sense, you respond to this terribly fine-grained representation of life because you see yourself in it. These are the things that we think about all day long.
Okay, so the way that we're talking about this book makes it sound like memoir, and yet we're also calling it a novel. It is a novel. How is it fiction?
That's a good question. I'm not even sure I can answer that question. And as a memoirist, I have a sort of dog in this race. And in fact, I raised the question in my review. I thought, why did he not call this a memoir? Because it purports at least to be a careful reconstruction of his life. The people in it have the names that they have, many of them in real life. He keeps talking about his efforts to reconstruct the facts of the past. And obviously it has to be, it's fictional to the extent that, who knows, there are pages and pages of dialogue from when he's 7 years old.
Right,
so
how could he possibly?
Right, but, we could do that if we tried. Maybe it's not exactly what your grandmother said to you at Thanksgiving, but something like that. So I'm willing to go with that. But I think he wants it to, it's a novel because it does shape, although he pretends that it isn't. He pretends that it's just sort of coming out in the way that it actually happened, which, of course, one can't really believe. There is a loose shaping going on. There is a control on the part. Look, he's not telling you everything. Every omission is also a writerly choice. It isn't everything that happened to him, although God knows it sometimes feels like that. So, but I'm not quite sure I can answer that question. I don't know why he calls it a novel instead of a memoir, except that I think the novel still has more prestige than the memoir. The memoir is seen as a kind of soft genre, and he wants to be a big literary figure, and memoir is not the ticket to get there.
Well, the word of the moment is autofiction.
Autofiction.
Would you call this autofiction?
Yeah, it's certainly more like autofiction. I'm getting a little leery of that label to some extent. I think it's a kind of having your cake and eating it too. Although there are super interesting works, but I think it reflects to some extent the anxieties of our era about the place of the, let's call it, narrating self in contemporary culture. Because, as you said before, in every moment of our lives, every time you post an Instagram picture, every time you tweet, every time you update your Facebook status, you're engaged in a autofiction to some extent.
Creating a narrative.
It's true to the extent that these are real pictures and real postings, and it's not, it's sort of fictionalized to the extent that you're not putting the ugly pictures of you from your Hawaiian vacation, right? So that's a kind of parallel to what I think these people are doing in their novels.
How would you describe the narrative structure here across the 6 volumes?
Well,
because it's not strictly chronological.
It's not chronological. It's loosely chronological. It begins with the death of his father, and that's the trigger for this Proustian look backwards to the childhood, the death of the father, who was sort of disintegrated and was an alcoholic and died in very sordid circumstances. And that's the trigger. And then there's a long flashback, as it were, to these childhood years. And that's the first book, which I think, like many people, I think is the strongest and has the strongest, what we would call narrative structure, I guess. And then the second book is really mostly about his marriage to his current wife. And then the third book starts the real retrospective movement because he goes back to his early childhood. And the next volume is his adolescence. And the next volume is his 20s and 30s. And the final volume, volume 6, brings us up to the moment. It's very meta. The final volume is about the publication of my struggle in Norway in the mid-2000s and the effect that it had on him. So it's loosely chronological with some very suggestive hiccups, I would say.
So we're getting this all in a kind of delay necessitated by the act of translation, et cetera.
Yes.
Okay. All of this has already happened in Norway. Right. How was it received in Norway?
Well, I think it was hugely controversial. I can't remember the exact statistic, but Norway, as I know from going there, Norway is a small country. I think the total population is like 4 million, We can maybe find out that fact very easily. So it's like Queens, basically, and everyone knows
and everyone
each other.
reads, and everyone knows.
Reads, and the literary culture is, as you would imagine, very small and tight. And here he is already, we have to remember he was already a novelist with some acclaim when these My Struggle volumes started coming out. And because he names people, that's where the auto fiction comes in. He names people. He talks about real people, his first wife, his friends, his uncle, his family. It was really controversial. I think I read some statistic that like 1 out of every 4 people in Norway read this book or some extraordinary thing like that. So it made him a household name.
Let's talk just for a few minutes about the 6th book, because that's the new one. It's just out, and it is different from the previous books, not only because it's kind of this retrospective on the entire project, but also because, getting back to the title, he is making a point here.
My Struggle is the translation of a very famous book by Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. And so almost from the beginning, you sort of sat around thinking, how, why has he called this My Struggle? And the payoff is in volume 6. And I have to say that unlike some of my colleagues in the field of literary criticism, I actually really enjoyed this very bold and not totally successful, but bold structural device, which sort of lands right in the middle of book 6 and which is meant to explain the My Struggle analogy, which is this almost 500-page long analysis of Hitler's book. And I think, to make a very long story short, I think the punchline, so to speak, is that he does I thought a sort of remarkable thing, which is to using Mein Kampf, but also a host of other literary sources that sort of digress and meander and come back in very interesting ways. He analyzes the life of the young Adolf Hitler with strong implications that they bear many resemblances to his own early life. The abusive father, the megalomania, the grandiosity. And it's as if to say, and this is where I think all of his technical ambitions come together. What is a life? What is a life at the end of the day? And so here's Hitler, and he has the same kind of father and in some ways a certain parallels to this guy Knausgaard. And yet, of course, Hitler is Hitler and Knausgaard is Knausgaard. And I think that is a sort of aesthetic justification for this minute reconstruction, because it's as if he's putting his own life under a kind of microscope, trying to figure out why his life came out this way and somebody else's life, which could be thought of as being rather paralleled, came out in a totally different way. And, the struggle is just to try to make sense of it. And I have to say, I thought it was kind of dazzling in a way. I mean, it does sit there, as Dwight said, like the snake that ate the dog or whatever.
Dwight Garner, our critic, who did not admire that section as much as you did.
Yeah, but I mean, there's no way you could say this is integrated in any normal way of understanding a structure of a book. But in itself, I thought it was quite interesting.
I mean, so he raises this question. Does he have any kind of answer, or does he come to any conclusion?
No, I mean, at the end of the day, but he does say something that I thought was very interesting, which is he, by many byroads, comes to a kind of final pronouncement about what Hitler's problem was, so to speak. I know that's a kind of a silly thing to say, and he has a very interesting linguistic analysis. He said Hitler could only imagine an I and a they, but not a you. He can't confront the other. He can only think of himself, the great I, and other people. And it's an interesting idea, but of course, as in my reading, it unfortunately also describes him to some extent. And this is where I come back to my point about there being no oxygen left when he's in the room, because it's all about him and then they, meaning everyone else in his life. But you don't feel addressed in some crucial way in this project.
But do you think he sees that? Do you think he sees that in himself?
To his credit, I think he probably does, but he is himself. He can't be anyone but himself.
All right, I need to ask one final question, which I always ask of Knausgaard completists, especially as someone who has not read a single word. If you had to say to someone who has, like me, not read this, where do you start? Do you need to read from book one? Should you only read book one? Is there a value in reading the entire thing? Because I've gotten different answers from everyone I've asked. Some people say go directly to volume 3 or,
Interesting. I mean, I think you probably could read any volume. They're not connected by a kind of plot. But and I'm certainly not alone in thinking this, I think volume 1 gives you, as it were, everything you need to know about the project. And many friends of mine, and I mean writers and sophisticated literary people, have said, well, I read the first one and I started the second one and I realized I basically got it at that point. So I think if you had to read one, I would read one, which I think is, for me, is the strongest, just in terms of being a complete work unto itself. And then you will be able to go to a cocktail party at which literary people are present and hold your head up high, I think.
You won't have to say that you're among those who have not read Ferrante or Knausgaard. Right. All right, Daniel, such a pleasure to have you review for us anytime and to review 6 books. It's like a 6-fold bonus. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining us now, Jill Lepore with her new book, These Truths, A History of the United States. Jill, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is an interesting moment to have a new 1-volume history of the United States, but you started this a while ago. This is not like a post-election.
Yeah, I couldn't crank this out that fast. I started it 3 years ago, although you relies on material like lectures I've been giving and essays I've been writing. I've been teaching American history 25 years. So it's my time to kind of put all the pieces together.
You're a professor at Harvard of history. Do you teach an actual survey course of American history?
Yeah, I started to just a few years ago when I decided to write the book, because we haven't offered a U.S. history survey class in decades.
Really?
Yeah, because the kind of consensus view of American history fell apart in the 1960s, and people were just kind of shy of doing it. I mean, actually, a lot of faculty don't like teaching survey course. I love doing that kind of teaching, but what would you include and what would you not include? And it would be subject to, student protests. You're just like, it would be hard to offer.
I mean, that's so fascinating, because I was a history major, and the first thing I took was, that survey of American history.
Yeah.
Is that fallen out of fashion in general in history departments?
I think it, ranges from institution to institution. Yeah, it in some degrees, to some degree, it has fallen out of favor.
And so while you were teaching that, knowing you were writing this book, was there a 1-volume history out there that you thought, okay, this is the most reliable? Or was it that, there wasn't an updated single volume that you had to reach to multiple sources?
Yeah, so there's not. I mean, there are many textbooks. They're all our team written, and they serve a very interesting purpose, but they're not readable as books. They don't have an author. They don't have an authorial voice, and they don't have a sweeping interpretation. And the books that do exist that have sweeping interpretations and an authorial voice tend to be highly ideologically driven. Mm-hmm. So there isn't such a thing to assign. So when I taught the course, it was because I knew I wanted to write the book and I actually want to stay on deadline.
Right.
You have to go in and lecture. It's like, shoot, I have to cover Andrew Jackson through the Civil War today. I got to write a lecture in 3 days. It was actually a great kick in the pants to actually stay on deadline.
And that'll help with chapter 16.
That's right.
When was the last single volume history of the United States written?
The one that I think people know about, there have been many. But the one that reached a wide audience, and I think still does, is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States.
Which is a very, very particular point of view.
It's a very particular point of view, and it's a very old book. I think 1975. I mean, I'm sure that he updated it, But I was thinking about, it makes this kind of interesting cameo in two fairly recent films. It's in Good Will Hunting. Do you remember? He keeps, the Matt Damon's character keeps quoting Howard Zinn. And I think Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were famously like fans of Zinn. And they went to a high school where Zinn was the book that was assigned. My kids go to the high school they went to.
So that book has become a standard?
It is actually assigned all over the place. Even though, Zinn was, a very lovely man, but it actually is not a good account of American history.
No,
academic historians would would reject it. But kind of fascinatingly, it makes an appearance in Lady Bird last year.
Oh, interesting.
And she meets this. Did you see the movie?
I have not seen it.
All right. Well, she meets our incredibly beloved, charming, vivacious, sassy, brilliant, independent young woman high schooler meets this horrible would-be boyfriend at a cafe, and he's very pompously reading Zinn. Like, this is a marker of, like, the audience and when I saw it, the audience all groaned, like, this is how you know he's going to be a really bad boyfriend. Like, he's just going to be so pious.
So it's gone full circle from being like the cool, the kind of thing that the cool guy reads to being like this sign of like.
Yeah, it's it's a certain kind of bad boyfriend.
And he's going to be like occupying some building rather than.
Yeah.
So you're working also on a textbook version of this book, correct? Yeah.
So I was asked to write a textbook version just for the college market and I thought that was a great idea, but I didn't want to write in a textbook voice, and the textbook doesn't have a textbook voice. I said, I think the public really, just because we have quite lacking really good. It used to be that when any American historian got to a certain point in his career, and I say his advisedly, he would write a sweeping account of American history. That was just the thing you did, like check, like then you become professor emeritus. That was the thing. And then when those guys kind of lost their particular authority within the academy, or when American history exploded and became more complicated because women and people of color went and got PhDs and really kind of ripped up that story, people stopped producing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the public just really hasn't had that, right? Like Zinn wasn't a historian, he was a political scientist. There just really hasn't been like the commitment of historians to do this work. So I said, I'm happy to write the textbook, but I want to write a book for ordinary readers first, and I can turn it into a textbook and add whatever, charts and graphs and maps and the things that you would want to have in a textbook. But I thought, like, in the absence of that big book,
mm-hmm.
people just kind of pick and choose little bits of history that justify their political positions, and that's going to always happen. I don't mean the book kind of solves that problem, but it seemed worth putting out there, a book that people could use as a baseline and argue with, and someone else can come along and write a competing interpretation and make the hard choices about what belongs and what doesn't belong and how to hold the story together.
Well, you're only 52, so it's too early to become an emeritus, having now written the book. But you did mention that that these books were written by men. And do you think that as a woman, that the way that you wrote this or your approach is inherently different, or was it consciously different?
I think that all of American historical scholarship has suffered from a kind of segregation where we have, especially from in the public, there's a kind of political history that's the history of presidents, and we have a lot of presidential historians who take up a lot of, I suppose, kind of airtime talking about the presidents. And then there's this incredibly rich scholarship on women's lives, on the lives of people of color, LGBTQ studies, stuff about sex and gender. And the one kind of history, that political history, is just kind of all about power, as if power is just top down. And the other kind of history is all about powerlessness, as if these people engaged in social movements don't actually have power. So for me, because I started out really a long time ago when I went to graduate school, I wanted to become a women's historian. I didn't. I'm a political historian. But I have always wanted to bring those two kinds of historical writing together, because you cannot understand any presidency without understanding those social movements.
Right.
And those social movements can't be understood absent their influence on presidential politics. So this is a book that tries to reintegrate, because obviously we know now, like we really know now, that you can't separate those two things. To the degree that we separate them, it's just artifice, right? Like it's just convenient to say this is going on and then this is also going on. But in day to day, you cannot breathe the air in this country without seeing that Black Lives Matter is completely tied up to Obama's presidency in ways that are really important and interesting and worth thinking about, and you shouldn't understand one without the other.
And yet, the way that you're saying that history is often studied and talked, and the books reflect this, it's very fragmented. It's like one particular period and one particular perspective, or a focus on this and a focus on that. The fact that you say that at Harvard there hasn't been a survey of American history makes me wonder if we're losing something in not having this kind of, history taught at this scope where everything is brought together and woven together so that people see these common themes, not only in university, but also, the regular reader that you're trying to reach with this book.
Yeah, I think we do lose something, and we allow our past to be as polarized as our present. And that's a trap because we can't make arguments about the future when we have such a polarized past. I think we also forget that it's important to teach history as a mode of inquiry and not as sort of like, here's a set of like known facts, received information that I bequeath to you. And we get that. We get the importance of that energy of inquiry when we celebrate and pontificate about the importance of STEM, right? Like that's a whole like.
And then they had to make it STEAM to put
right. They had to make it STEAM, right? But like. Team. I don't know, like what? Like historical thinking is something we do every day. And to do it with method and with care and a concern for evidence and argument and to a willingness to engage in confrontation and disagreement with other people who want to dispute your evidence or engage in a conversation about your interpretation seems to emphasize something they don't think was as important. Like that work of thinking about the relationship between the past and the present is a universally necessary skill that we have de-emphasized to our peril.
You've written, however, some excellent books of what one might call microhistory, whether it's about the Tea Party or about Jane Franklin, Ben Franklin's sister, and I think that was the last time you were here, or Wonder Woman. This has to be a very different kind of challenge to write, I think, a 932-page book, something like that, encompassing 1492 to 2017.
It was really different. I don't like that it's called microhistory because it seems as if it's diminutive. Like, oh, it's about a woman, therefore it's little. Like my book about Jane Franklin, I meant that book as a really ambitious intervention in the conversation about what matters in the past and how we understand what matters and its consequences. And I think people kind of took it as, oh, it's like a ladies' auxiliary story. It's like a compendium about the first ladies, or like. And that really bothered me. And I think that, just as someone deeply involved, obviously, in thinking about publishing as an industry, that books written by women that can be extremely ambitious, and they're classed as like a kind of twee little effort.
Right.
And a book written by a man that is like 1,000 pages of pretty much crap that involves no original research, no original thinking, is magisterial. And it's written with muscular prose. You see that. You see that all over the place.
Yours is lyrical and written with whimsy.
Yes, right. And that's what you're going to see. And it drives me a little crazy. And it was part of why, when I was asked to write the textbook first, I was like, Then I thought, this is one of those opportunities where it's important to say, I will do the thing that cannot be confused for something that is lacking in ambition.
It also, there's just a tremendous amount of, you have to assume a tremendous amount of authority in this kind of book because you're the one who is deciding what goes in and what, gets kicked out, perhaps, that was always there as being something incredibly important. But I'm assuming you have to make choices about what to include in a book like this when you're squeezing in so much history.
Yeah, you do have to make a lot of choices. And, I lost a lot of sleep thinking about stuff that I knew that I was going to have to leave out. But
what made you lose sleep?
Oh, I would have wanted more sense of place, like more sort of richly set local scenes. I love that dramaturgical work that you can do as a historian. But I really emphasized plot and character, to the degree that it's a real narrative. And I just, in order to get through the material, I couldn't linger over what the Southwest was like in the 16th century. I just couldn't use those words. So that was frustrating. But I remember when I first started teaching, when I was in graduate school at Yale, and I remember all of our teaching instruction was about you should divest yourself of your own authority in the classroom. The classroom is a space you have to create for the students to express themselves and form their own identities. And I remember thinking this is kind of a crock. Just when women and people of color enter the academy and get PhDs and stand behind the desk and stand in front of the lectern, suddenly we're supposed to divest ourselves of authority. We're the people who are supposed to divest ourselves of authority. I already enter this classroom. I'm barely older than my students. I'm shorter than them. I'm a woman. They already don't impugn any. They just don't grant me any authority. I'd have to earn it. And it really, that has always troubled me as a scholar. And then part of that comes out of feminist pedagogy. And it's piece of feminism that I actually just always found to be pretty much just bunk. Like that's not what I am about. And here I'm happy to engage with an argument that I should have included more sense of place, that there isn't enough sense of place in this account. How can you call this history of the United States when we were never in these places?
Right.
I'll have that argument, but I made that choice and that's my choice.
But I think that I would imagine that also, and that some of this is very political in terms of which are the voices that were previously excluded. You talked about post-1968, that the Academy exploded, that everyone realized, well, we haven't really accounted for Native Americans, and we haven't accounted for African Americans or for women or for Mexican Americans or for laborers. You've got to now take all of that and get that in. Right?
Right.
Still keep it a nice, readable, movable narrative. I would imagine that some stuff has to fall out that maybe was in those big Professor Emeritus 1 volumes of the 1930s and the 1940s.
Right.
Were there things that you just said, this in the grand scheme of things can kind of be demoted a little bit or de-emphasized?
I have two answers to that question. One is I looked at books I really admired from that last moment when people were still writing these kinds of books.
And when was that last moment?
There was a book from, I think it's 1955 called Out of Our Past. This beautiful little book. And the historian who wrote the book said in the preface, he's like, look, I've chosen to emphasize things that I think people need to know given where we are now. So for instance, this is 1955, the year after Brown v. Board of Education. There's a lot here about race and civil rights and slavery. But I'm going to tell you, there's nothing in this book about American Indians, which is the phrase he would have used at the time. Like it wasn't a live present, like in the mainstream, a big political argument in 1955. And that was like, this is just my rule. It's like, do you need to know this to be a citizen acting today in our world? So in some ways, I made that my rule too. There are things I left out because they don't happen to be a huge political moment. But since I was also trying to write something that worked like a civics book, I do kind of hit more marks. Like I spent a lot of time in the Bill of Rights or things like that maybe wouldn't have gotten the same equal attention. But again, the other answer I would give is that you're absolutely right, and it's a decision from the very beginning. I mean, the book starts in 1492 with Columbus, and I've heard from people who've said to me, who haven't read the book, by definition, I will never read your book because that is just so ethnocentric and racist.
Right,
a book that begins in 1492 is not a book I would ever read. And I don't have a lot of patience for that position. I mean, the reason I begin there is I'm actually also trying to reach the reader to whom that date is actually where the story begins. And like they begin that, you meet people where they are. I mean, the chapter is actually about, the horrible word for this is problematizing, but like the chapter is actually about problematizing 1492 and thinking clearly about why this date assumes this particular cast, what was significant about it and what significance has been imputed to it and what starting there obscures that we need to actually reveal and expose. So that's how I tried to deal with some of those issues, was to just kind of be completely intellectually honest with the reader. Like we're going to start in this year and give it a minute and let me explain why.
Mm-hmm. And what were the things that you most wanted to emphasize? Like, what were the correctives that you wanted to make? What, you're talking about this historian who's writing in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, and therefore thinking maybe in terms of Black Americans. Were there things that you felt like, this is where my point of view is going to come in here?
Yeah, there's a few. So one would be just emphasizing constitutionalism, the origins and history of the Constitution, which weirdly, because social history took over the academy, isn't emphasized in a lot of textbooks. Another is the history of religion, especially evangelical Christianity and fundamentalism, which, because liberal academics tend to be secular, hasn't really been emphasized enough.
It often gets its own history.
It's incredibly well researched, but it isn't really married to the political narrative the way that it should. Slavery and race, Jim Crow and civil rights are not sort of sidebars in this book. They drive the narrative. And that has always been my understanding of American history, that actually the tangled relationship between liberty and slavery, between equality and inequality, that dialectic is the engine of American history, and it's very painful to look at in that way, but that is quite central for me. The other two things are the history of technologies of communications. So we see now that political communication technology has a huge consequence for our political arrangements and can provide equilibrium and it can provide disequilibrium. That has always been the case, and it's actually helpful to offer a past to that. So it doesn't seem like suddenly there was Twitter and Facebook news and all hell broke loose. But in fact, there have been moments like that throughout American history. And then finally, I guess I really can't emphasize enough how fantastic, and you know this, the incredible richness of the revolution in the writing of history of private lives, and especially the lives of women and families, that just hasn't really broken out of the academy in the way that it should. That's why I wrote that Jane Franklin book. That's why I wrote the Wonder Woman book.
Mm-hmm.
And still, it doesn't disrupt our political narrative.
It's interesting because there's a whole fascination in the UK with that kind of history, that kind of like my life as a Victorian, a day in the life of an Edwardian, and, you know, welcome to the farm of the pre-industrial age. That really doesn't seem as
That's right. Yeah, even just at the popular level. Yeah. But what I'm trying to do is think about the ways that if you take women seriously as half the population, long before women get the right to vote, which doesn't happen, of course, till 1920, they act politically in ways that are just as if they had never happened in most political histories, like as if women weren't involved in the abolitionist movement, as if women weren't introducing a whole style of politics, the moral crusade, into the kind of American political toolkit. You know, in other books, you kind of get like 1848 and women come out and do a curtsy, and then Gloria Steinem like screams, but that's it. And this book tries to like that sort of integration works.
You mentioned earlier that you see this as a kind of civics lesson, and in the book you say that this is a kind of old-fashioned civics book. What do you mean by that?
I just mean by that, you know, a lot of the little bits of the book come from New Yorker essays I've written over the year, and often I'd write a piece, like I remember I wrote a piece about the history of the secret ballot. Like voting in secret is a fairly new thing. It didn't really become law until the 1880s, 1890s. And I'd get floods of emails, especially from high school students and college students saying, like, we had to read your article, your essay for class, and I never knew that. I thought the secret ballot was in the Constitution. Like, maybe we shouldn't vote in secret anymore. And people will be very grateful to have some just basic democratic institution explained to them. And each time that kind of sunk into me. And each time I thought, well, I wish that these weren't evanescent, these little histories of institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this book, I wanted to put those all in. Like, what is a right? What is sovereignty? Who are the people? What is representation? These basic ideas and the basic institutions. Why do we vote? Why do we have primaries? What is a nominating convention? How has the power of the Supreme Court changed over time? These basic matters of civics that, since we don't offer civics in high school in most places anymore, I wanted this book to carry a little bit of that weight.
This is not a post-election book, but the election happened while you were writing the book, right? You thought you were going to end with Obama.
Yeah.
And then we get 2016. So how did that change the book? And specifically, was it just adding another chapter, or did it sort of cause you to kind of go back and think about, like, how can I show this coming? Like, this is not out of nowhere entirely. Or was it already there? Did you?
Yeah. It was a tricky situation. I was like halfway through. I was right around the Civil War when the election happened. And the reason I was going to stop with Obama was just like safely in the past. I mean, by the time the book would come out, it was almost a decade ago. For a historian, that's sort of comfortable. Like, we have probably some idea how to understand how Obama got elected, say. We don't, a verdict on his presidency seems totally premature, but it also is a great ending. Like, just a great, fantastic, narratively, like, it just lands.
Right.
The
end.
The end. And then Trump got elected, and I thought, like, that's just not, I can't not add that. I have to go up to that election because it's a realigning election. It elicited a conversation about the state of the democracy and its long history that needed to be in this book. And yet I have no perspective. I mean, you guys get, I'm sure, in these offices day in and day out, books that purport to explain that election. You've gotten them, probably since before the election was held.
Yeah, we here at the Book Review have figured it out.
Yeah, good. All right. Yeah,
we
so
read all the books.
Explain it to the rest of us. But, I look at those and I'm like, how can anybody dare to explain that election just yet? So,
right.
I mean, obviously people are engaged in a different kind of project than a historian would be, but historians just don't have enough. We just don't. I think most historians would not feel like we have sufficient vantage on an election that was held 2 years ago. So it was tough to do, but at first I found myself kind of coaxing my narrative so that I could get him elected and it wouldn't seem to come out of nowhere or something.
The Whiskey Rebellion becomes all the more popular,
becomes all the more
important.
And then I just sort of decided, like, I cannot do that. Obviously, the election could have gone any other way, and a sense of historical contingency is important to a reader. So I didn't reimagine what I had already written, although when I went back and revised it, things just read differently. Like stuff about Mexicans that were said on the floor of the Senate and the House during the debates about annexing Texas and then the Mexican-American War and acquiring the top basically half of Mexico in 1848. It just reads differently on the page after hearing Build the Wall, for 2 years. So I didn't add that stuff. That stuff happened the way it happened. Events unfolded in the way they did. But I think things just seem more, they seem to foreshadow something that's a little bit different.
It's an incredibly powerful thing to sort of, present. Here is the history of this country. And I'm curious if there was one person or one little fact that you thought, like, I'm going to get this in. This has not been in any of the big major histories of this country, and it should be there.
Oh, God, there were so many of those. Like, that was the most fun, just finding stuff I didn't really know about. Little characters who could stand for a social movement or stand for an idea. I will say I actually found Phyllis Schlafly incredibly fun to write about. She was just an incredible person, a force of nature. Her political influence has been really underestimated because liberal scholars just don't. And conservative scholars, she's a woman.
She wrote a lot of books.
She's really, really important, and she's fun to write about and intellectually fun to think about what she managed to do and quite how she was doing it.
All right. Just one figure among many in this new book. It's called These Truths, A History of the United States by Jill Lepore. Jill, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Joining us now are critics Dwight Garner, Jen Salai, and Karl Sagel, here to talk about what they've been reading this week and reviewing. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Dwight. What did you write about this week?
Well, Olivia Laing, the great English writer, she's written 3 books of nonfiction, and now she's out with her first novel called Crudo. And, we've all, I think, had crudo in restaurants. It's the small sort of raw fish dish with olive oil and salt. But no one eats crudo in this novel. There is a lot of eating in it. But it's a strange, she's sort of feeling her way, I think, into fiction. It's sort of a hybrid book in the way that her nonfiction books were. Partly it's the story told in real time, a bit of autofiction about a writer named Kathy who's about to get married. And it's set in 2017. So Trump's there and Brexit and the Grenfell Tower burns. And so she's reading Twitter and getting upset and about to get married. The book gets unusual in the sense that this woman's name is Kathy Acker. And we know Kathy Acker was sort of the downtown punk writer and performance artist, the author of Blood and Guts in High School and other books, who died in 1997, far too young of cancer. And it's very odd to have Kathy Acker sort of, imported into this novel set in 2017. And I'm not sure that Laing quite pulls it off. She's a lovely writer whom I like quite a lot, but this novel just seems sort of somewhat half-baked.
It's a short novel.
It's very short. It's about 140 pages. I think she was aiming for that. I think, there's this school of English writers right now, women who I just can't read enough of, Rachel Cusk and Deborah Levy, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Levy, who write these short, intense novels that are kind of set in real time, a bit of autofiction. And her book definitely fits in that category. It just doesn't work quite as well. I think that, she tried, maybe it's the Kathy Acker stuff. Maybe she tried too hard to import this other sensibility into her own. I just wanted to read Olivia Laing. I wanted to know what she was thinking. And instead it's this sort of seance feeling of Kathy Acker and Olivia Laing trying to talk over each other.
Do you think she's more naturally a nonfiction writer?
Maybe, but I would hate to say that. I don't think she deserves to be pigeonholed. But so far I would say yes. But I would read her next novel in a heartbeat.
Karl, you also reviewed fiction this week.
I did. I had a very good week. I reviewed the new Deborah Eisenberg. It's a book called Your Duck is My Duck. And Eisenberg is one of the great modern masters of the short story and a writer of insane slowness and exactitude. She takes like a year to write a short story. Her first story took her 3 years. This book is her first book in, I think, 12 years.
Wow.
And yeah, you think about it, like one book, it's 6 stories, right? So each story comes to us very shaped and worked. But the beautiful thing about these stories is they're never fussy. You can't see the seams. They've all been sanded away. It's this beautiful experience of falling into this sort of fictional machine. Then just like beautifully just works on you. I know I've used about like 11 metaphors in that last paragraph, but
luckily it's not in a review.
Luckily it's not in a review, and luckily it's from an excess of admiration and enthusiasm. It's a really good book. It's a book that's a very hard book too, because she like Auden, right, is one of our great writers of End of Empire. And she's writing out of these ashes of guilt, collective guilt, individual guilt, and paralysis. And she's written these books about people that like people in Crudo, actually, it occurs to me, are watching the news and feeling helpless. They're seeing people and children in cages while money flows around the world. She's this great sort of comparison. They don't know what to do. They're feeling sick. They can't sleep. Should they take sleeping pills? Should they volunteer? Should they do this? Should they read less news? And so it feels like, as they say, like it feels of the moment in this way, but it also feels much bigger. She's really, really thinking about what it means to think about living an ethical life. But all of this to say is that these books are never serious. There are so many good jokes.
She's funny.
She's wickedly funny. She's great on heterosexuality and its discontents. She's great on the way people look and the way they sound. I mean, when you read these, I close this book with this feeling of reverence. I'm like, I can't believe you did this in 12 years.
There was so much anticipation around
so
this
much.
book.
I mean, and I think that in like the recent few years, we've seen the way that her career has been talked about. Eisenberg's, also Laurie Moore, Lydia Davis, these great American women masters of the form. And I think that they've been treated, I think, with a little bit more reverence. Eisenberg's collected works came out, I think, almost 10 years ago, this mammoth collection. She's won a MacArthur. So, I feel like in certain ways the establishment is recognizing these women, but I really wish more readers would.
Karl, can I ask you a question? What do you think about the ways that 2017, 2016, 2015, Trump, Brexit, all of these things are starting to seep into the novels we're reading? I'm already occasionally a bit tired of it.
Yeah.
We're still early on.
Talk about, sped up cycle.
And a lot of writers have done it quite well, but I'm picking it up now. And so many novels coming out now are just about people leading normal lives while in the background they're obsessing, as we all are, on Twitter and online. I'm just wondering what you think so far about what you've read.
A lot of fatigue. I think it's a really hard thing to write about anything current in a way that is going to feel really fresh and relevant. It can be Trump, it can be technology, it can be anything that people are talking about. How do you make it your own? And I think the books that have done it well, I think Eisenberg does it well. I reviewed a collection of poems by Terence Hayes, which I thought was just gorgeous. And I think when they do it well, they're not looking at Trump as phenomenon, as this moment as phenomenon. They're looking at it in a way that feels existential as well as political. And they're looking at the conditions that produced this moment, not just this moment. And they're trying to ask bigger questions about, like what Eisenberg says, how do you live an ethical life ever? How do you live an ethical life in this moment?
I agree.
But it is really difficult. And I think that, I'm kind of looking at next year with a little bit of dread.
Exactly. Here we are only halfway through, or a little bit more than halfway through 2018.
Yeah.
And these books have not yet begun to emerge. So I'm hoping for a masterpiece.
I thought there was a small masterpiece, not on Trump, but on technology in Zadie Smith's short story, her last one in the New Yorker. I'm forgetting the title now, but
was it canceled or something?
Yes.
I disagree. Yeah, I thought that I felt like when I read that story, I was like, oh, you were actually not on Twitter. It's like when Franzen writes
she's
about,
not. Yeah.
Or like when Franzen writes about like impurity, when he was writing about Facebook and Twitter, I was like, you actually aren't there. You don't know how this works. You're not seeing small things. Like you're seeing it as this blunt tool with which to exclude or ostracize, but you don't have that like little fine grainy vocabulary. Lang does. Like when I peeked into Crudo at various points, like she's smarter about actually how people are using it and what for. And she's very good in The Lonely City, her nonfiction book about what it's like to date using the internet and to meet people and to have crushes with people on Twitter, So she just has more of a vocabulary, I think.
For listeners who haven't read the Zadie Smith story, the crucial image for me, I agree with Karl that it doesn't quite work, but it's going to stick with me, I think, for a very long time because it's set in this sort of a slight pushback against the Me Too movement and ganging up on Twitter and other social media sites against the daily offender, someone who said the wrong thing. So these professors are all living in group housing at NYU, what's supposed to be NYU. And each day they point little arrows in their windows towards the one apartment where this person is the current offender. And somehow that image is a very striking one.
Yeah.
And I give her credit there were some very striking things in that story.
Well, speaking of great artists, great women artists who sometimes get ignored, Jen.
Yeah, so I actually had to write out the title of the book so I would remember it because it's so long. The book I reviewed this week is by Mary Gabriel, and it's called 9th Street Women. First part of the subtitle is Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning, Grace Hartigan, Joan Mitchell, and Helen Frankenthaler. And then the second part of the subtitle is 5 painters in the movement that changed modern art. And so,
in general, the longer the subtitle, the worse the book. I'm not saying that in this case.
Oh, well, it is interesting because I have to say that when I started the book, I wasn't crazy about it. I mean, I think partly it's because, first of all, the story of the post-war New York downtown art scene has been told many times before, usually revolving around the experiences of Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, the sort of macho, hyper-masculine men who really dominated the art scene at the time, or at least that's the story. And so what Gabriel does in this book, and what she sets out to do in the introduction to the book, is she says, I want to tell the stories of these women, some of whom were partnered with people like Pollock or de Kooning, but they themselves were very talented and eventually accomplished artists in their own right. And so at the beginning, she really sort of wants to set them up as these intrepid heroines, which sort of just got me suspicious right up front. But then as the story sort of unfolds...
Why did it make you suspicious?
Well, because I knew a little bit about their stories to know that it wasn't just a matter of feminist triumph.
Right.
It was really complicated. I mean, their lives turned out to be, full of not only incredible accomplishments, but also abuse. I mean, that's a big part of the story, which, this was actually part of the thing that I struggled with the review is, first of all, how do you get enough information into 1,000 words? I mean, it's just really hard to sort of contain it, especially when the story is so explicitly about 5 women. So it's not like you can only just mention one of them or 2 of them. Mm-hmm. You really have to at least try to grapple with everything that's going on. But as I read the book, and she just sort of brings in, she starts out also with Lee Krasner and Elaine de Kooning, who are the oldest artists in the group, and their stories are also the ones that are most familiar. And so when she brings in Grace Hartigan, Helen Frankenthaler, Joan Mitchell, you just sort of get this, I hate this word, but I'm going to use it here, kaleidoscopic sense of the art world at the time, and just sort of how many different things were happening, how people felt about the newfound fame that was coming their way. Because, before the 50s, really, I mean, these were artists who were desperately poor. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, she talks about how Elaine and Willem de Kooning would eat ketchup in hot water as like tomato soup. Like that's, I mean, and their work actually didn't sell for a long time, but then once it did, all this money sort of came crashing into their lives at once. And what that does to a person, what that does to sort of their relationship with art. I mean, it turns out to be a way more complicated story than I think she even set out to tell at the beginning. So that's what I ended up really enjoying about the book. And, and I feel like the subtitle, exactly, it's like a very long, dutiful subtitle, but the book itself is just stranger than that. And I can understand why she couldn't really get it in the introduction. But there we go. After, I think it's about 800 pages of text, something like that, you get a better sense of things.
Was there any one of those 5 women, or the story was told by the author, that you found particularly interesting, or you learned something new that you hadn't known?
I felt like I did learn something new about each of their stories, even Lee Krasner and Elaine de Kooning, whom I knew a little bit about before. I mean, the one person that I did talk about in the review a little bit more was Grace Hartigan, who, what was kind of fascinating to me was that she actually, unlike the others who did have some art training, she didn't get to take any art lessons until she was a married woman with a baby in New Jersey, and her accountant husband had basically told her, wow, you are really interested in art, you should take a class. And so she ended up taking a class, ran off with the art teacher, moved to New York. And then, the art teacher, who I think at the time actually was a little bit known, he was part of the New York art scene, and he introduced her to people. And she, in terms of her own work and her own career, totally surpassed him, left him, led this completely bohemian life. And at the same time, I mean, one of the themes in this book that Gabriel looks at is the issue that some of these women had with raising a family, whether they wanted to raise a family or didn't want to raise a family. Grace Hartigan,
they did with the children they had.
Right, exactly. So Grace Hartigan is the only one of them who did have a child. And she ended up, as she says, making the very harsh and cruel choice to abandon him to the care of his paternal grandparents because she felt like there was no way that she could actually really pursue her art while also taking care of a child. And the other women, at least at the beginning of their careers, felt they couldn't have children. Some of them changed their minds later on. It's actually interesting. Elaine de Kooning at the beginning, I think she gave an interview where she said, I borrowed a friend's baby for a day and I took the baby to my studio, and this was a very, good, well-behaved baby, and the baby napped the whole time. But even then I felt like I couldn't do it. And Willem de Kooning really wanted children. I mean, that's the other interesting thing. Pollock and Willem de Kooning both wanted their wives to have children.
Jen, is there a classic study of female artists, women artists, and child rearing or not child rearing? Is there a study?
I don't know.
It seems like a great topic. It seems like something that female artists have always been invested in. And currently, the recent fiction by women like Sheila Heti and others, and Rachel Cusk, this is just an obsessive question.
Oh, yeah.
About whether you can be...
But is there like a big group biography or something like that?
If there is, I'm expecting our podcast listeners will send us emails letting us know what we
Please
missed.
tell us.
All right. A full lineup of women writers and artists and all their complications. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.